In 1805, artist and poet William Blake put the final strokes on what would become his most famous painting, The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun. The watercolor depicted a strange and gruesome humanoid monster standing with wings outstretched and back turned toward the viewer. Nearly 2 centuries later, this painting would be referenced in Thomas Harris's novel Red Dragon, the first book to include the character of Hannibal Lecter. While the eye is drawn to the towering monster in the painting, it's the second figure that inspires our curiosity. Reclining before the great red dragon is a woman in a yellow dress, a strange light surrounding her. This is the mysterious woman from Revelation 12, the inspiration for an entire series of Blake's paintings. She appears pregnant, and the dragon stands ready to devour her son, who will one day lead nations. Her clothing is made of sunlight, and beneath her, the moon, and her royal status is portrayed by a crown adorned with 12 stars, one for each tribe of Israel. But this woman isn't an invention of Revelation's author. She appears again in Micah 5, where she is the mother of the shepherd of Israel. In Isaiah 7, she's the virgin who will bear a son named Emmanuel. And Proverbs 8 says she stood beside El Elyon at the beginning of time, and together they established the heavens and marked the foundations of earth. But before all of that, her name was inscribed on Canaanite tablets at Ugarit, where she was called the Great Lady and Virgin Mother of El Elyon's children, one of which was made leader of Israel. She's the Canaanite goddess Asherah, the Queen of Heaven. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. If you've been keeping up with the show, then you're aware that this section of the Bible is concerned with prophecy. Isaiah and Jeremiah, writing after the fall of Jerusalem, busied themselves with strange visions and oracles concerning Yahweh's wrath on Judah and the surrounding nations, as he hurled destruction from his abode atop Mount Zaphon, far to the north, or sent the ravaging Babylonians rampaging across the land like a locust plague. Ezekiel fits well within this category, depicting chaos and destruction, judgment and justice, as well as little glimpses of hope for the people who have suffered so greatly. However, the book of Ezekiel differs from Isaiah and Jeremiah in a few areas. In those other books, when the authors used the term Israel, they were referring to the northern kingdom which had fallen to the Assyrians. It was a term of exclusion, differentiating Israel from the southern kingdom of Judah, which was the author's focus. Here in Ezekiel, the opposite is the case. Israel is used as an inclusive term, denoting the whole of the people linked by a shared identity, as opposed to divided among national borders. So while the earlier books still saw Israel and Judah as distinct nations, Ezekiel now envisions them as a shared identity, linked by their destruction and deportation at the hands of the invading Babylonians. Eventually, these two nations would become unified, but that is still centuries away. Another oddity in this book is a new term for their patron deity. As Ezekiel experiences his nearness to Yahweh, he describes it in terms of his title for Yahweh. The experience of this nearness, standing in the very presence of his deity, prompts him to call his God Sovereign Yahweh. This term, used frequently in this book, is a term not found elsewhere in the Bible. Ezekiel's state of morality and frailty is frequently contrasted with the awesome power of his deity and intermediary heavenly figures who address him. This is done through a title or descriptive of the prophet, that of Son of Man. While this term will take on a new meaning in the following centuries, here it is used to denote his mortality and humanity. It's one used to distinguish him from the terrifyingly powerful heavenly beings who address him throughout the book. While they're transcendent and unknowable entities, Ezekiel is a mere son of humans. The term Son of Man will become a proper title for a messianic figure, but here it carries no such connotation and can be replaced with the term mere mortal. And with those distinctions out of the way, we can get started. The book of Ezekiel is divided by some study Bibles into 4 sections. The introduction in the first 3 chapters, warnings of calamity on Judah in chapters 4 through 24, warnings of calamity on other nations in chapters 25 to 32, and finally the promise of Judah's restoration in chapters 33 to 48. Since 48 chapters is a bit much to cover in a single episode, we'll be splitting this book into approximately 16 chapters per, covering the intro and some of the warnings to Judah today, finishing the warnings of Judah and the other nations next episode, and saving the promise of renewal for episode 92. Or at least that's the plan. And if all goes according to plan, then this statement will be considered a realized prophecy. If not, then I must be a false prophet and should be summarily stoned. I guess we'll find out my fate in a few months. No prophetic work is complete without a call to service, and Ezekiel gets that out of the way in the opening chapter. And what a chapter it is. It begins in the 13th year, though it doesn't say what this is in reference to. Is it the 13th year of the exile, the 13th year of a king's reign, the 13th year since Snoopy lost a dogfight to the Red Baron in It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown? I feel pretty certain that it wasn't that last one, but it may have been the 13th year of the character's life. According to Numbers chapter 4, this was when a young man would begin training to become a priest, so we'll go with that explanation. Our narrator is 13 years old, set to begin training as a new priest, and it's been 5 years since the exile began. Ezekiel is sitting beside the river Chebar in Babylon near Nippur when he has a vision of Yahweh. It's described coming upon him like the hand of Yahweh himself, so this is abrupt and unrelenting. A great storm with strong winds came from the north, the mountaintop home of Yahweh, and it flashed with fire and lightning. Remember that Yahweh has long been associated with both storms and volcanoes, so this would be fearsome and terrifying to behold. But that's not all that this poor young lad saw. In the middle of it was a flying saucer. It's described as gleaming like amber and made of concentric circles, moving in any direction it chooses, and made of burnished bronze, and lights, and emitting a fierce energy along with a lot of noise. At least that's how the History Channel describes it, and so does this text, if you choose to ignore the same bits that Georgios Tsoukalos ignores. Of course, this isn't a flying saucer, and we don't omit important details on this show for sensationalism, so let's see how this is actually described and what this is in reference to. Amidst this raging storm cloud was something that resembled 4 living creatures. Later, these will be identified as cherubim in chapter 10, but at this point in the tale, we're only told that they resemble living creatures, and they go unnamed. Each of them was humanoid in form and had 4 wings. Okay, so like a giant fairy. That's not so bad, but they also had 4 faces. In the front was the face of a human. On the right side of the head was the face of a lion. On the left side, the face of an ox, and on the back of the head, they had the face of an eagle. Instead of feet, they have hooves. Their wings were also outstretched, the wingtips of one touching the wingtips of the next living creature. And the second pair of wings that they each had were wrapped around their bodies to cover them, which may have been a euphemism for the covering of their genitals. In their midst was a pile of burning coal, and lightning and fire flashed between them. There were also strange wheels beside and beneath the 4 living creatures. They were described as a wheel within a wheel on each of the 4 corners of this strange gathering, and the wheels were covered in eyes. The creatures moved in unison, and as they moved, the wheels rolled beneath them. Far above their heads was a great crystal dome with a sapphire throne above that, and seated on that great throne was a great human form surrounded by fire. Upon seeing this figure, Ezekiel recognized it as Yahweh himself and fell flat on his face. So what are we to make of this? Is this really some strange UFO recorded by an eyewitness in Babylon some 2,600 years ago? Sadly, no. The 4 living creatures are common in temple complexes in the ancient world. Things like the Lamassu and Sphinx are examples of this. Ancient people imagined powerful guardians for their cities, temples, and palaces, and they were often imagined as great chimeras, which combined the most powerful living creatures they knew: the strength of the bull, the intellect of humans, the speed of eagles, and the ferocity of lions. In this case, these chimeras are part of the temple complex, as is evidenced by the inclusion of the interior description. The Great Dome is the ceiling of the temple upon which was painted the sky and the constellations to depict the firmament. Above that was the throne of first El Elyon and later Yahweh. We caught glimpses of this in Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah. See episodes 52 and 59 for those descriptions. We already know that the Ark of the Covenant was seen as the footstool or seat upon which Yahweh sat or appeared, and it was decorated with these cherubim with interlinked wings that spread over the top, just as they're described here in Ezekiel 1. In fact, the only new feature here is the strange wheels that are covered in eyeballs, but that isn't really new, is it? This is part of the chariot throne that we've seen before. Chariot thrones weren't uncommon in the ancient world. Just as lions were fearsome hunters, chariots were fearsome weapons. They even defeated Yahweh on the field of battle in Judges 1:19. So a throne in the shape of a chariot denoted military might, exactly the kind of symbol you would expect from a warrior god. Among all of these things are the torches and braziers and jewels associated with Yahweh's inner sanctum. And the presence of Yahweh, as we've seen countless times before, coincides with the dense clouds of smoke from incense and cannabis. So this entire chapter is a vision of the inside of the Holy of Holies, meant to mirror Yahweh's throne room on his hilltop palace on Mount Zaphon. Sorry to disappoint you, but there will be no aliens in this episode. Oh, and no angels either. The living creatures are cherubim, and the wheels are ophanim, and neither are called angels, nor are the seraphim. It'll be medieval scribes and theologians attempting to clean up the heavens who decide that they're angels, not the biblical authors. So a biblically accurate angel is still just a human form, occasionally with wings. Sorry for that disappointment as well. But as prophetic callings go, this one is hard to beat. We won't see its equal until Revelation 4, so score 1 for Ezekiel. In chapter 2, Yahweh instructs Ezekiel to stand on his feet so the deity can speak with him. Having little patience with the groveling man, Yahweh sent his spirit into the new prophet and lifted him up on his feet. Then the God began speaking. He said he was sending Ezekiel to the people of Israel, a people he describes as rebellious and stubborn. They probably won't listen, but at least someone will have tried to save them from themselves. They deserve a warning, even if they refuse to heed the message. Yahweh then unrolls a scroll, and written on it were words of lamentation, mourning, and woe. This is meant to be chapters 4 through 24, the warnings of calamity to come on Judah. So, just as Yahweh carved stone tablets with the covenant for Moses, now he writes scrolls for Ezekiel. This gives subsequent chapters the ultimate pedigree. Ezekiel is delivering words written by the creator of the universe himself. While the message may be bitter, the taste is sweet, as we learn in the opening lines of chapter 3, as Yahweh has his prophet eat the scroll, literally shoving his words into Ezekiel's mouth. It tasted of honey and filled his stomach, meaning that the message of destruction concerning Judah was actually the key to its salvation and offered hope to the doomed people. Unfortunately for those people, they're stubborn and hard-headed, so they'll have to suffer a little bit before they get the message. Then the Spirit of Yahweh seizes Ezekiel and lifts him up, and he was carried away to where the exiles lived at Tel Abib, where he was dropped unceremoniously and sat stunned for a full week. And if you're thinking that Ezekiel's visions and subsequent hangover sounds like he's experiencing a bad trip, remember that archaeological evidence from ancient Jewish temples reveals the copious use of recreational drugs to induce altered states of consciousness, which was a common practice in shamanistic rituals. After his recovery, Ezekiel is informed that he will be taking responsibility for the people he ministers to. If he doesn't make this effort and they fail, Yahweh will punish Ezekiel for their fate. If he's successful in his ministry, or if he makes a sincere effort, but they still refuse to repent, only then will Ezekiel be spared the fate that awaits the wicked. He'll be treated like a watchman on the city walls. He must warn them of the approaching danger, even if they are intent on ignoring the warning. Any lapse in his duty will be met with lethal consequences. Still, not much is expected, as the people are repeatedly described as being stubborn and wicked and unlikely to listen, an indication that the exiles are beginning their time in captivity as a wicked people worthy of their punishment. Then something odd occurs. Ezekiel is instructed to shut himself inside his house, where he will be bound with ropes, and Yahweh himself will make him mute, completely unable to address the sins of the people. So Yahweh is setting the prophet on a mission to save the people, but then completely removing Ezekiel's ability to perform this task. And what is the reason given? Because, according to the last verse of chapter 3, Yahweh has already decided the fate of the people. So Ezekiel, before he even utters a single word of prophecy, has become a prophet with no message, a sentinel who is barred from standing watch, and the people's rebelliousness, which Ezekiel could address, will be used as an excuse to punish them. In chapter 4, Ezekiel must bear the punishment for the houses of Israel and Judah, while also serving as a warning to them. He must first lie on his left side for 390 days, one for each year of the punishment for the land of Israel. Once the prophet has suffered through this, he must then lie on his right side for another 40 days, one for each year that Judah will be punished. While doing this, he is to look toward a miniature model of the city of Jerusalem, with miniature siege works built up against it that Yahweh has instructed him to create. So Ezekiel is trapped in his own home for about 14 months, staring at a model of Jerusalem, bound with ropes and muted by magical forces, accumulating bed sores all the while. While this sounds pretty horrific, a torture pulled straight out of the movie Seven, it is only just getting started. For the entire time Ezekiel is trapped in this miserable state, he's to eat a single meal, a bread made from a variety of ingredients and prepared over a meal of dried human excrement, which symbolizes the corruption of the people and their impure bread offerings, as well as the miserable living conditions of the people under siege and those being deported. While traveling, people traditionally used dried dung of beasts to build fires, but when being deported, there wasn't enough such fuel to go around, so they would be forced to make do with whatever they can find, including human waste. The importance of sacrificial bread will be a topic I'll dive deeper into later. But suffice it to say, this may very well be far more important to the dispute between First and Second Temple cults than most people realize. Yahweh then informs Ezekiel that he intends to cut off the food supply to Jerusalem to punish the people for their sins, causing them to suffer starvation. This may seem a bit odd, since the people, along with Ezekiel, are already in exile, but we must remember that the exile occurred in stages, with small groups being taken away over the course of many years. The final destruction of Jerusalem would happen a few years after this scene is meant to play out. Ezekiel continues to reenact the plight of the people of Jerusalem in chapter 5 as he shaves his head and beard with a sharp sword. The shaving was meant to be disgraceful, and the use of a sword was to represent the military defeat at the hands of the Babylonian army. His hair is then carefully divided into 3 equal portions. 1/3 is burned inside the city, another third is chopped up with a sword outside of the city, and the remaining third is scattered in the wind. The author seems to have forgotten that Ezekiel isn't actually anywhere near Jerusalem, so he can't go running about the city destroying hair in particular places. All of this is simply meant to symbolize the fate of the people of Jerusalem, as is explained later in the chapter. A third die of starvation and disease during the siege, a third in combat beyond the city walls, and the remainder are dispersed into the surrounding nations. All of this is, of course, because the people failed to follow Yahweh's commands. As mentioned countless times before, this is a polemic against one style of worship by authors who follow another style of worship. They lay the blame for past military defeats at their religious opponents. Other arguments from this group include pretending that their denominational enemies are actually foreigners living within the land. Whenever a biblical text speaks of Canaanites, this is what's happening. All of those people were native Canaanites, but one group was distinguishing themselves from the rest and claiming that the other Canaanites were not true residents of the land and had no right to live there. A disturbing detail emerges in verse 10 when Yahweh informs the people that he will do something truly terrible to them, more evil than anything he's ever done before or will in the future. He'll inflict such dire hunger on the residents of Jerusalem that the people will resort to cannibalism. This will come up again in Lamentations 2:20. That's right, Yahweh will force parents to eat their own children. Let that one sink in for a moment. And all of this, the siege, destruction, slaughter, starvation, disease, cannibalism, exile, and diaspora will occur, according to verse 13, because Yahweh is angry and wants the people to know how powerful he is. This is the same reason given in Exodus for the plagues when he repeatedly prevented the Pharaoh from releasing the Hebrews. Yahweh needs an excuse to demonstrate his power, and setting up an entire nation for disaster and slaughter is his MO. One final note on chapter 5. When Ezekiel discards the final third of hair to be scattered, a few strands are to be gathered up and tied into his garment. This is to represent the remnant that will be carried off into exile. They're spared, but their fate is still precarious. The next oracle comes in chapter 6 and is a warning against the hilltop shrines used for honoring the gods of Israel, including Yahweh. If you recall from the Genesis episodes, the people were commanded by their God to construct these shrines. But after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel, the government in Jerusalem attempted to consolidate worship in the city and outlawed these countryside shrines. Many were torn down and desecrated, as the archaeological evidence shows. Now, during the exilic period, use of these shrines is linked with Yahweh's rage, giving another polemic against the religious practices of the native population. Ezekiel is to set his face against the mountains and give prophecy against them. Yahweh states that he'll destroy their high places and altars, incense stands, and idols. Then he'll slay their people and scatter their bones around the altars. This would be the worst possible desecration for such a shrine, completely profaning the once holy ground. This rage exacted upon the hilltop shrines is meant to mirror the Babylonian desecration of Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem, though archaeological evidence suggests this is a bit anachronistic, as these shrines were dismantled and desecrated long before the Babylonian conquest, and for completely different reasons, as previously noted. Again, this is to be done so that Yahweh may flex his divine muscles and make the people realize how truly powerful he is. And, as we've come to expect, the people who erected and used these shrines are blamed for the deity's rage. The use of Yahweh's shrines, which he commanded their ancestors to erect, is now considered an evil abomination which has led to the disease, starvation, and slaughter of the nation. But this desecration and destruction isn't reserved for the hilltop shrines alone. The holy trees and sacred groves will suffer the same fate, as the closing verse of chapter 6 informs. Places long associated with proper worship, such as the grove where Deborah, the only female judge from the book of Judges, who served as Yahweh's leader of the nation, were also to be destroyed. All of these shrines and holy places used by worshippers of Yahweh are to be destroyed because Yahweh's emotions have been bruised. Chapter 7 sees the true terror of Yahweh fully blossom as he announces to Ezekiel that an end has come to the four corners of the land. Now, let me take a moment to explain this because I don't want you to get the wrong idea. In texts such as this, when someone says the four corners, or the four winds, or the four ends of the earth, they don't mean that the earth is square with corners like a giant chessboard. That would be ridiculous. They believed it was a disc, like a frisbee, because that makes more sense. Anytime you read about the circle of the earth in the Bible, this is what they mean, the earth as a disc. We examined this topic in episode 52. So what do they mean when they talk about the four corners? This is used in the same manner as it's used today, to mean the entirety of the world. It means that, as far as you go in any direction, there you'll find Yahweh's wrath and destruction. It's not a reference to the author's belief concerning the shape of the world. The number 4 often pops up in apocalyptic literature, and when it does, it's usually in a phrase that expresses the entirety of something. So just as Yahweh first executes judgment on the corrupt temple, and then the countryside shrines, now he expands his wrath from Israel to the entire world. Also, I'd like to point out the spatial imagery that is utilized by the author. In the last chapter, Yahweh's judgment was vertical in perspective, going from mountaintop to ravine. Now it's horizontal, spreading from east to west, north to south. It's easy to miss, but once you see it, you should be able to appreciate this detail. Also, chapter 6 focused on religious sins, the worship of hilltops and sacred groves, as well as the use of idols. Here in chapter 7, the sins are those of violence, corruption, abuse of power, greed, and mistreatment of people. So the focus has shifted from religious sins to social sins. Yahweh declares that he will not have pity on the people, and will heap upon them evil upon evil. An end of days is coming to them as he vents his anger with sword, disease, and hunger to punish the lawless and the wicked. Even those who flee will die in the wilderness. They'll wear sackcloth and shave their heads in shame, and nothing will save them from Yahweh's wrath. Survivors will be delivered to the foreigners to live as slaves to the wicked, so they can be defiled by them. They will beg for peace, but none will be found. They'll suffer one disaster after another and become an example to other nations. In chapter 8, Ezekiel is sitting at home in the 6th year since the first Jews entered the exile, and suddenly the hand of Yahweh fell upon him again, as he was gripped by another vision. He looked up and saw a figure that resembled a man wreathed in flames and shining like polished bronze. This figure showed him a series of visions, beginning with the abominations in the Jerusalem temple. This string of visions will continue through chapter 11. This spirit, which turns out to be Yahweh, seizes Ezekiel by the hair, which has grown back by this point since he last shaved it, and it hauls him up, which is quite rude, if I may say so. He then dragged Ezekiel into the air between earth and heaven and showed him a vision of Jerusalem. He shows Ezekiel an image of jealousy that the people were facing. This implies a great idol of some sort. Thankfully, we know who this is. Similar stories from elsewhere in the Bible, such as 1 Kings 15:13, 2 Kings 21:7, and Jeremiah 44, speak of idols in this way, and they were to the Queen of Heaven, who has appeared in several episodes already and is the great mother of the Israelite pantheon before their shift to monotheism. She was present at the creation of the universe and helped El Elyon direct his creative powers when he organized the chaos. In Ecclesiastes, she is called Lady Wisdom. This is the goddess Asherah, who was the wife of El Elyon and later of Yahweh. For centuries, she was worshipped alongside Yahweh and the other gods within the Jerusalem temple. Ezekiel is then taken to a courtyard and peers through a hole in the wall to see people worshipping idols of serpents and other animals. This would be Nehushtan. Yahweh commanded the construction of this bronze idol back in Numbers 21:8. Like Asherah, this deity was featured prominently within the Jerusalem temple for centuries, and might have even decorated the doorway along with depictions of the Tree of Life. We first encountered Nehushtan in Genesis 3 in the Eden story, where he guarded the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge. Before these idols stood 70 elders of the house of Israel, sending up clouds of incense. Then Yahweh took Ezekiel to the north gate of the temple, where a gathering of women sat weeping for the god Tammuz. For those not in the know, Tammuz was a Sumerian fertility god who was slain and descended into the underworld, where he was tormented by demons, later to be rescued by the goddess Inanna, so he could be resurrected. He spends half the year in heaven and half in Kur, a dark underworld cavern. This represents the lengthening and shortening of days due to axial tilt. After midsummer, when the days gradually begin to grow shorter and the ground is dry, resulting in infertility of the soil, this is when Tammuz has died and descended into the underworld. When the days begin to grow longer and life returned to the land, it was because Tammuz was ascending once more to the heavens to bring light and life to the world. This story was retold at annual festivals, and his death was marked by ritual mourning by priestesses and female worshippers. Israelite worship of Tammuz seems to have been alive and well in the period in which this book was written, and the author obviously objects. Later writings, such as 2nd Maccabees, recount how Jews, as late as the mid-2nd century BCE, were still wearing pagan charms and apparently practicing polytheism. And it was during this period that their temple of Dagon was destroyed in the city of Ashdod. The final affront to Yahweh in chapter 8 has to do with people turning their backs to him. In the closing verses, he takes Ezekiel inside the temple itself, where he sees 25 men prostrating themselves on the temple floor, facing east toward the rising sun. While we may see this now as pagan sun worship, we need to remember a few things. First, Yahweh is repeatedly depicted with solar imagery, including in this very book, where he returns to the temple with the rising sun, appearing in the east so he can shine in through the open doors and reach the inner sanctuary in the opening verses of chapter 43. His link with the sun, shining and bringing life, ascending in the east, and so on, is prominent in Isaiah as well as the Psalms. So this isn't some strange pagan sun god that they're worshiping here. This is legitimate worship of Yahweh, who was thought of as a rising sun god, who entered the temple through the open doors at dawn. It's why the temple had to be constructed in this fashion in the first place, as was dictated to Moses during his mountaintop visit with Yahweh. This was typical of ancient solar deity temples. It was a feature, not a bug. While Ezekiel is here exclaiming that the people are turned away from Yahweh, they're in fact doing the opposite, facing the sun god as he appears on the horizon before entering his temple, as he will later do in chapter 43. But if this was traditional Yahweh cult practices, why the objection? Because these practices were traditional and not part of this post-exilic reform. Yahweh was no longer being worshipped with idols, nor was he being seen as just another sun god. He was envisioned as transcending these simple images and practices, and was becoming something else entirely, a deity that could not be seen by the average worshipper. Long had he been sealed away in the Holy of Holies. Eventually, he would have no physical appearance at all. This was part of that long transition, the shedding of symbols such as the spear-wielding clay warrior, the golden bull, and the rising sun. Again, this isn't one religion chastising another for their profane practices, but a newer version of a religion, casting dispersions on the older version. We'll see this repeated when Second Temple Jews are lambasted by sectarian Jews who have adopted an apocalyptic vision and began writing their criticisms in a collection of works that would form the foundation of the Christian Bible. Now that we've dealt with the sins of the community and sins of the rulers, it's time Yahweh turns his attention to punishing the idolaters. Chapter 9 opens like a scene from Revelation. That's because Revelation is in the same genre of writing as Ezekiel. Yahweh beckons forth a group of vengeful spirits that he calls scourges of the city, though this is sometimes translated as executioners or destroyers. They appear as 6 men approaching from the north, walking side by side with weapons in hand, accompanied by a 7th man wearing linen robes and carrying a writing case. Longtime listeners of the show will recognize this man as the Elect One, or the Son of Man from 1st Enoch, who records the deeds of men and sits in judgment over humans and angels alike in the heavenly courtroom. He's our divine records keeper, and in his hands is the Tablet of Destiny, in which he details your fate. His appearance alongside armed divinity bodes ill for those he seeks. Think of him sort of like Santa Claus. He made a list and he checked it twice. Now he's come to deliver justice. Okay, so he's not exactly like Santa Claus. The presence of Yahweh then goes up from the cherubim where he had previously rested, and called to the man in the white linen, and instructs him to move through Jerusalem, marking the foreheads of those who object to the idolatry and abominations committed in the temple. Then to the 6 armed figures, he instructs them to follow after and slaughter everyone who doesn't bear a mark on their foreheads. They commence with their bloody work, beginning with the elders gathered in the temple and moving out from there, slaughtering men, women, and children. This is our Exodus Passover story come to Judah's capital. The mark on the forehead, similar to the lamb's blood on the doorpost, is the secret name for Yahweh that the high priest would wear on his forehead on the Day of Atonement. When the slaughter was done, the man in linen robes reported the completion of his task to Yahweh. Only a scant few were left, referred to as a faithful remnant. These people who remain are to become the ancestors of those who will later, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, enter the land and establish a new religion that will come to be known as Judaism, an amalgamation of the older Hebrew religion, Babylonian traditions, and Zoroastrianism. This is their origin story, the survivors of Yahweh's anger when he slaughtered his own chosen people for the worship he once prescribed. Chapter 10 gives us a vision of the interior of the temple and the heavenly throne of Yahweh. Ezekiel looked up and sees a sapphire throne above the cherubim and the top of the firmament. Yahweh told the man in linen to reach into the wheels beneath the cherubim and remove a double handful of burning coals and cast them over the city of Jerusalem. One of the cherubs removed the burning coals and placed them into the man's hands. While this happened, Yahweh moved down from the throne to the interior of the temple and was accompanied by a thick cloud of smoke. Once the coals had been placed in the man's hands, Yahweh once more took his seat on his throne above the cherubim. This scene seems to switch between heavenly vision and temple vision, from the sky up above to the interior of the Holy of Holies. This is because they were imagined as one place. The temple was meant to represent Yahweh's heavenly throne room, so the strange chariot throne inside the temple and the grand sapphire throne up above the firmament were not two separate places. One was a dim reflection of the other, an earthly representation of the true location in the heavens, sort of like a shadow cast by an object. Earthly objects and events were the mirror image of the objects and events existing and transpiring in the heavens up above. And the burning coals are heavenly weapons used by Yahweh's forces to destroy and purify, as with the burning of Sodom and Gomorrah, and with the lips of Isaiah before he could speak prophecy. Chapter 11 may seem like a contradiction, as it deals with the people living in Jerusalem. They've already been judged in chapter 9, and most of them were then slaughtered. But chapter 11 is a parallel oracle, not a subsequent one. It may be to expand on the message of chapter 9, or it may be another version altogether, and the editors decided to keep both instead of omitting one version or the other. It starts with 25 men on the east of the temple, just as we saw in chapter 8. This would mean that they're the same elders who were slaughtered at the beginning of the purge in chapter 9. This time, some of them are given names. They're accused of giving wicked counsel to the city, so the Spirit of Yahweh falls upon Ezekiel and causes him to give prophecy against these men, accusing them of filling the streets with slain people like a great pile of meat thrown into a pot. A bit of projection, if you ask me, considering the great multitude that Yahweh slaughters in Jerusalem. Yahweh then gives Ezekiel another prophecy, that the people who have been cast away and scattered through foreign lands will one day be gathered up and returned to the land of Israel, which Yahweh gave to them. When that happens, he will enter the land with them and rid it of atrocities and place in the people a new heart, so they will keep his statutes. He finishes up by stating that those dedicated to their atrocities will feel punishment brought down upon their heads. Now that Yahweh has dealt with the people and the temple in Jerusalem, it's time for Ezekiel to have his vision of them being sent off into exile in chapter 12. These people have eyes but do not see, a reference to their refusal of divine wisdom. This is why Jesus works so many miracles healing the blind. It's symbolic of granting wisdom, not of curing eyesight. Ezekiel goes out of his household, packs a bag for the people to see, and then exits through a hole in the wall and walked off into the darkness. This is to show the people, through Ezekiel's actions, what will become of them. They'll grab their meager belongings and march off into the unknown. The effect is spoiled by the fact that he's already in exile and demonstrating this to people who departed Jerusalem a decade earlier, but it's meant to have been a prophecy for those who were still in the city, so we should pretend that Yahweh teleported the prophet again so that he could give this demonstration to those who had yet to be deported. Though it could have been taken as a warning to those already deported that their families would soon be joining them. The punishment which would be visited upon those in the city was being recounted to those already living in Babylon, and it could knock some sense into them. It isn't a very compelling argument, though. Then Yahweh speaks out against those who doubt prophecy in verse 21. People in Jerusalem are grumbling about these prophecies of doom, all while their city still stands. Years go by and the warnings of destruction fail to be realized. So why should they care about another such oracle? Yahweh warns that soon all shall be realized, and never again will people doubt such prophecy, for it will come to pass before their very eyes. This sense of immediacy will be seen again in the Christian Bible, as gospel authors speak of the impending fulfillment of prophecy concerning destruction and judgment. But those writings, like Ezekiel, were written shortly after the fact, as is often the case with prophecy. But that's missing the point. The point isn't to predict the future, as these are written much later. It's to move a post-exilic people into action and to serve as a solid foundation for religious change. By setting the prophecy before the destruction, the author can use it as a warning for his own contemporaries. If you continue to do the things that you're doing, you'll suffer the same fate as those people from long ago. This is the purpose of prophecy. Yahweh continues his chastisement on prophecy in chapter 13, turning his attention to those who speak falsely in his name. These are called prophets of peace, those who claim that great destruction is in fact not imminent for the city and its people. Those who preach peace did not receive their oracles from Yahweh and are speaking falsehoods. This too has been seen before in Deuteronomy, when Moses says that any prophet whose message doesn't agree with his own message is a false prophet and must be put to death. It's another polemic against any with whom the author disagrees. These men are prophets of false visions and lying divinations, as verse 6 declares, and Yahweh himself has spoken against them and will punish them presently, so that they understand that he is their God. Yahweh threatens his traditional storm of violence, treating us to another link with storm god imagery, as winds, hail, and flooding rain are turned against these prophets of peace. Then he vents his rage on women who deliver prophecy. The charges levied against these women are the heinous crimes of making amulets and veils for people. The amulets are worn on the wrist and would offer good luck or divine favor. The veils are a means of marking an individual for life or death, and if you recall from chapter 9, that's Yahweh's job. He, or his heavenly clerk, decide who gets a mark on their forehead, not some prophet. These services were paid for through bread offerings, similar to how the temple priests accept offerings of bread, oil, wine, meat, and money for their services. At no point in the chapter is it stated that these women worship other gods, or that these amulets display symbols for deities other than Yahweh, so we can't assume that polytheism lies behind Yahweh's objection, though we can't exclude it either. The objection expressed is that these people are buying charms, and we're now in a period in which such things are forbidden, even when they depict symbols of Yahweh. The rest of the prophets and priests are judged in the following chapter, and many of them are found to be guilty of idolatry and turning from Yahweh. Some prophets and priests, though they worship Yahweh appropriately, still keep the idea of idols alive in their hearts. These idols, or thoughts of idols, have turned these men away from Yahweh and thus led their followers astray as well. The purpose of priests and prophets is to guide the populace, thus the creation of the Torah, with its many laws and guidelines. But these priests have turned from Yahweh and failed in their mission to properly guide the people. For this they'll be punished, so that some of the people might be saved and thus return to Yahweh. Their sin is portrayed as a stumbling block that they establish for themselves, and they must overcome it if they are to be saved. Beginning in verse 12, Yahweh announces his plan to bring famine and starvation to the land, punishing human and animal alike. And unlike previous times of punishment, such as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah when Abraham could stay his hand for a moment, Yahweh informs Ezekiel that even if Noah, Daniel, and Job all stood before him, he wouldn't withhold his divine wrath from the people. Those three righteous men would only succeed in sparing themselves. He promises to send famine, bloodshed, wild beasts, and plague, the same threats we've seen from him several times in this episode. Ezekiel's next oracle is the Parable of the Vine. It's a short poem, only 8 verses, that comprises all of chapter 15. In it, he explains that the wood of fruiting trees can be used to make furniture and houses and tools. But the wood of a vine is only good for burning. It has no lasting use and is quickly devoured. Such is Judah, portrayed so often as a vine from which rulers sprout. But now its useful fruit has withered, and the vine itself produces nothing but fuel for the fire. So Yahweh will use it one last time. He'll burn it up and discard the ashes, because the land of Judah is good for little else. If the fruit isn't faithful, he has no use for the vine. This is Yahweh's view of the people. If they don't praise him in the manner he now desires, they do not deserve to live. We end this episode with chapter 16, the story of Lady Jerusalem, a goddess figure we've come to know well, especially since covering the wisdom literature. As we now cover this chapter, it's important to remember that in antiquity, many cities had a patron deity. Babylon had Marduk, Uruk had Inanna, and Jerusalem had Asherah. So when the city is personified as a woman, it's only allegory in part. The crimes of the city do represent the crimes of the people, but also the later attitude of the Yahweh's priest toward the goddess once worshipped within the city. So keep that twofold meaning in mind as we cover this chapter. Lady Jerusalem, whose father was an Amorite and whose mother was Hittite, was a strong Canaanite woman who was born but discarded. Bloody, she was found in a field, unwashed and with umbilical cord still attached. So Yahweh came to her and spoke life into her and helped her grow. Here we see a reversal of the familial myth, which originally had El Elyon and Asherah as father and mother of the pantheon, with Yahweh or Baal as either their favorite son or their grandson. Now he's playing the role of father to Asherah, so she's been demoted from the role of mother to a subservient daughter, just as Leviathan was demoted from pre-existent chaos dragon to just another animal that Yahweh had created for sport, as we saw in the book of Job. Yahweh helps her to grow like a plant. Recall the vine imagery from the previous chapter. And then he describes her naked body as she becomes an adult, complete with full breast and pubic hair. These are attributes associated with Asherah's role as a fertility goddess. Yahweh then spreads the corner of his cloak over her to cover her nakedness, a symbol of marriage, and they entered into a covenant together. All of this is to represent Jerusalem's transformation from a Jebusite city to one that would be regarded as truly Jewish, a city rejecting one style of worship in exchange for another, as we saw in the Ezra and Nehemiah episodes, as the new temple required the abandonment of the old religion of Jerusalem. She's described as being adorned with gold and silver, silk and embroidered cloth, and fed the finest flour, honey, and oil. These are temple images, these splendid decorations and choicest offerings. But she's also described as wearing a crown, a fitting symbol for Asherah, who was the queen of heaven. Then we slip into the old accusations of harlotry, which equates worship of other gods and focus on idols with cheating on one's husband. This is the sin of the people of Jerusalem, who still worship the likes of Asherah and Tammuz and Nehushtan. She made high places where she served them as a prostitute, meaning the people worshipped on hilltop shrines instead of inside the temple. And offerings of oil, flour, and incense were given to her lovers, meaning other gods were being worshipped there. Then Yahweh accuses her of taking her children that she bore for Yahweh and sacrificing them in fire. We covered the topic of child sacrifice in earlier episodes, particularly in episode 83, when discussing parts of Isaiah. These were referred to as Molech sacrifices, meaning the sacrifice of a child through immolation, and these were often offered to Yahweh at his command, though the practice eventually fell out of favor in the region. She is accused of prostituting herself throughout the city, and even with the Egyptians, Assyrians, and Chaldeans, meaning the people of Judah were adopting the religious practices of their neighbors. He even accuses her of rejecting payment for her services, receiving nothing from her countless lovers. This is the claim that the other gods have nothing to offer to the people of Jerusalem because their promises are empty, just as their idols are the mere works of human hands. Only Yahweh can offer gifts to the people, because the other gods are all powerless to do so. Because of all of this, Yahweh will bring the penalty for adultery on Jerusalem. Leviticus 20, Numbers 5, and Deuteronomy 22 all demand the same punishment for a woman who cheats on her husband, the sentence of death. So her high places and ornaments will be torn away, and the goddess will be stripped naked. Then she'll be stoned and hacked to pieces with swords. This is the vision of justice from the authors for any woman who is suspected of cheating on her husband, and the righteous wrath of Yahweh inflicted on the residents of the city, to be clubbed to death, to be dismembered with swords, in bloody and brutal fashion after being stripped naked by soldiers. This is what Yahweh demands in order to quench his fury, to bring depraved wrath and brutality on an entire people because of his own jealousy. It is truly a disturbing chapter to read. Lady Jerusalem is then compared to Samaria in the north and Sodom to the south, her older and younger sisters respectively, who turned away from Yahweh and committed abominations and were thus punished with destruction. Jerusalem is said to be even worse than either of them. But like them, Yahweh will eventually restore their fortunes and those of Jerusalem as well. One important detail of note is that verse 49 elaborates on the vague accusations against the city of Sodom found in Genesis. There, it tells us that God judged the city for mistreating travelers, though the exact nature of that mistreatment isn't made clear in the story. Here in Ezekiel 16:49, it is clarified. The people there glutted themselves on food, but gave none to those in need. So refusing to share food with the poor and the travelers was the perceived crime of the city of Sodom in the book of Genesis. After Jerusalem is stripped naked, abused, humiliated, and torn apart, then Yahweh will remember his everlasting covenant made when the city was young, and renew that covenant, so that Lady Jerusalem will know that he is Yahweh. On that lovely note of spousal abuse, we'll bring this episode to a close. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.